Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, thanks. It's spring in Philadelphia and I can't complain. 70s, t-shirt weather, lovely.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we're looking at 80 today, and if I was outside, I wouldn't even need to be wearing this.
Yeah,
But
it's
it's
nice,
one of the
nice and
we're in the
cool inside.
yeah, that weird inversion time when the house switches from heating to cooling.
Yeah,
But yeah, so I'm got that spring thing happening, so I'm good with that.
nice. You were just mentioning to me that an idea came to you in the night. I can't wait to hear about it.
Well, you know, yeah, in our last conversation that we had with Allison, we hit a territory that got designated as deep water. And I thought that's kind of like a signal that there's something worth unfolding there.
Mm,
And so I started thinking about it. And basically, what I thought we should do to explore it was a phenomenological sortie unfolding Adolf Hitler.
okay.
The
So,
thoughts one
so
has in the middle of the night.
yeah. So maybe you could orient our listeners to what the deep waters were.
Well, I want to work up to there.
Okay.
And then maybe they can go back and see if they can figure out what the deep waters were.
Okay.
It's kind of I know it's a backwards way to do it, but what I thought I wanted to do was a sort of a phenomenological unfolding of Adolf Hitler because of because he perfectly I'm interested not in the historical Hitler, but I'm interested in the psychological, cultural phenomenon of Hitler. And, uh, and what has sort have happened around that psychoculturally.
Is this the egregore of Hitler?
Uh, I I think this is something a little different. I think that that Hitler might actually be the manifestation of a different energy through history.
Okay.
Because, the idea of a phenomenological investigation is one that we kind of unfold from the inside. We unfold from the subjective experience of the event or the object of inquiry. That's kind of the way we think about phenomenological investigations. So if I think about Hitler with that thinking cap on, I know it looks like a normal cap, but um, I start to ask myself some questions. Why does Hitler represent what Hitler represents? I mean, we've got a man here that ruined a complete style of mustache, at least for the next 300 years. We've got a character that epitomizes something. And I say something because there is a zone there because he represents slightly different things to different people, but still there is this like archetype going on there. And what is that? So I start to unfold that. What's my subjective experience? Because yeah, he killed a lot of people, but honestly, if to believe history as it's popularly told, really Stalin kind of outdid him.
Well, and maybe Mao outdid them
And
both.
I think Mao is reported to have outdone both of them. So if we're going to do it a calculus kind of thing, somehow he's got something else going on there, right? And if we were thinking of just pure cruelty, right? Well, to do that, we're going to go somewhere like Wallachia, right? And talk about Vlad the Impaler, you know, where where the badass army didn't want to go through his territory because there were upwards of 20,000 people impaled on stakes. They call it the forest of corpses, right? So it's like, I mean, literally, it's the thing that horror novels are made of. but Hitler's got something else going on there. And I started to ponder that. This is, because in the middle of the night, I'm fighting for space from the dogs, right? We're doing that sumo, that horizontal sumo. uh, Anybody familiar with pack life knows what's like, that's like.
Not the connotations horizontal sumo usually has, but
I guess
fair
that's
enough.
true. That's true. I was just shooting a skeet there. So, uh, but so I started to think, is there anybody else who kind of would be up there with Adolf in this what it is to be this archetype Hitler thing? And honestly, the person that leapt to mind, just maybe not a huge leap because he had a swastika tattooed on his third eye, of course, the Charlie Manson. And so when I start to ponder that, why what is the threat that Adolf Hitler represents? And it because same like Charlie Manson and Hitler, honestly, put me in a locked room with either one of them, maybe both of them in our prime. I I'm certain I'm the only one walking out of that room, right? There's a lot of people in the world I would not consider going in that room with. But these guys, they don't scare me that way, right? Like a few to the I mean, Hitler's no problem, right? And Charlie Manson, he's not a physically threatening character, right?
He's a little guy.
But you know what they call Charlie Manson? I saw in one of these documentaries. You know what they call him in prison and why they don't like him? They call him a mind fucker,
Mm.
right? So I start to unwind this and I start to think, well, when we think going back to Hitler, what do we think of when we think of Hitler? Now, everybody, different generation, maybe has different exposure. But in my generation, and maybe still in yours, what you see of Hitler is not him driving tanks. It's not him whipping or torturing people. It's not him doing any physically threatening thing. But what is he doing? We always see him doing oratory. Have you noticed that? We see him standing in front of the huge crowds and he's working it, right? And you don't even have to know German, but you know there's something is going on here, right? So the conclusion that I come to is that Hitler and Manson don't scare us the way that things outside of us scare us, but they scare us, in fact, because they scare us of ourselves, because they represent someone that makes rational, normal people do unspeakable, unimaginable things. And the fear is that they could actually bring that out in ourselves. This is my theory, right? So, what does this flash me to? When I see or when I imagine Hitler up there wildly gesticulating, I also I think of Huey Long. If you've ever seen any of the black and white photos of Huey Long, and he's this is in the days of oratory where you didn't have a megaphone, you didn't have a microphone, and you were speaking to a huge group of people. Now Hitler probably had microphones, but Huey Long, as I recall, didn't. And so he was shouting so everybody in the back row could hear him. And he was small to them in the back row, so he would wildly wave his arms, and so people could see what he's doing. And oratory for most of history was speaking, and by extension, writing. But it was this idea of a physical expression, and what it is basically is rhetoric, right? So now what a lot of people they know about rhetoric and they know about Socrates, and we've talked about dialectic, but what they don't understand and what we haven't really rhapsodized is the unfriendly relationship, let's say, between rhetoric and dialectic. And the reason was because rhetoric, for people that hear the word, I guess the most common way we hear that word is probably in the form of the phrase a rhetorical question, where we're asking a question that we don't expect people to answer. We're just asking it for the influence of the sound of the presentation rather than expecting an actual question. But the idea of rhetoric is an old, old idea. I think Pericles is one of these characters back in the war between Sparta and Athens, gave a famous eulogy of all the dead Athenians and with the idea of moving people so they would continue the war so they would triumph over Sparta, which I believe they didn't. But for folks that aren't familiar with rhetoric, rhetoric is very nearly identical to the idea of persuasion. And the reason that Plato and or Socrates, by extension, Plato had such a beef with rhetoric is because he said that rhetoric gives no care for truth or justice. It's purely persuasion. So what Adolf Hitler really represents on some level is the power of persuasion, the power of rhetorical persuasion traditionally delivered through the human voice. But during the time of Hitler, a thing happened that was technological, not unlike our time when we have new technological things. And the thing that had just happened in the 20s was the movies, right? But they wouldn't talk yet. And one of the things that Hitler did was he had a lady, Helena Riefenstahl, I think her name was, who created a movie for him called A Call to Will, was it? Or The Triumph of Will. I actually wrote it down. The Triumph of Will, and another one called Olympia. And what these were rhetorical devices enhanced mechanically, technologically to inspire people not to reason, but to emotion. And, it's interesting when we decide we're going to let them make judgments for themselves, we do it. We say they've attained the age of reason. We don't say they've attained the age of emotion because we're born with emotion. We start out screaming, right? so, so by Plato, and what's interesting with Plato or Socrates, he didn't just say that rhetoricians lead us astray by lying. He said that they did a form of enchantment of the soul, which pushes it almost a little closer to black magic direction, right? We're actually talking about enchanting people and engaging them in a way that's not necessarily about truth or about justice, although it may be. Both Aristotle and Plato allowed for the idea of true rhetoric, but I think with true rhetoric, we call that teaching, right? It's when it's not true rhetoric, right? When it's persuasion for the pure benefit of the person doing the persuading, right? And that's where the slippery slope begins. And that was kind of where the deeper waters were envisioned. Because the way that we do this is we don't just harness positive emotions, which is what Pericles did. We're Athenians, and we Athenians, we have higher ideals, and that makes us better. America used to do that, right? We have democracy, and we champion these virtues and these values. That's the positive side associated with your cause. But the other thing you do, which Goebbels and the Nazis did, of course, is you take negative emotions and you associate those with the other team. There's a famous quote, it's either Goring or Goebbels, where he says, "Of course, it's understood that the people never support war. So you have to associate the pacifists with exposing the country to danger. So you balance their fear, their lower emotion, against their higher emotion to seek peace over war. You literally play their lower emotions over their higher emotions." And that's why one of the observations that I have about moral courage that links up with this idea of increased responsibility falling on the individual more now than it ever has in history is because it means not just speaking truth to power, as we spoke about, but it also means speaking truth to our peer group. Because as we said, the slippery slope of morality is usually not one that we slide down alone. Usually we have peers there that are supporting it, that we might actually have to exert a type of courage. And it's much easier to speak truth to power if power is those motherfuckers. Right? Because of course you and all your friends and everyone that shares associations with you shares that value. So it seems like courage, but it's a small courage. On the other hand, to speak truth to your peer group when you are potentially, on a very different line than your peer group takes a type of moral courage. It takes a prioritization of truth or justice or knowing what's right over all those other emotions like wanting to belong, wanting to have acceptance, wanting reinforcement, all of those things. So to me, that's the personality challenge, and that's why both Confucius and Aristotle said we strive at this. We work over a lifetime to build that. And this dovetails into that idea of coming to completion. We don't necessarily start there with those push-up muscles strong. We kind of go through a process. So anyway, that sort of is my intro to the phenomenological dissection of the Adolf Hitler uh, phenomenon,
Meme. Yeah.
the meme. Now
You know,
it's not my favorite mustache. I'm not feeling the loss personally, but it's interesting that that association is still so strong. Like so.
I've been
Anyway,
I've
yeah.
been dowsing here as you've been kind of unfurling this topic for whether I'm with your assessment kind of each step of the way. And I thought the choosing Charles Manson was really interesting because that wouldn't have occurred to me. But and that might be a factor of our age difference, because he was in jail and kind of like a just another mass murderer slash serial killer, charismatic, culty guy. Um, and there were others who are just as interesting. Um, but I can understand the connection in a way, especially because you ended up at oratory and rhetoric. But I was thinking that to me, Hitler represents a dropping of the facade, and he may not be differentiated from Stalin and Mao, but the United States also wasn't involved in trying to deal with Stalin and Mao nearly as viscerally as it was Hitler. And so it's understandable that the imprint
Mhm.
relating to Hitler would be stronger.
The UK also, same can be said.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But I kind of the symbolizing what happens if the constraints are let go. And a lot of my associations in ceremonies with Nazism are methamphetamine fueled complete lack of compassion and
Reptilian.
reptilian, and so, kind of dropping the facade or dropping the mask, or yeah, releasing the collective shadow, right? In a way that, I'm sure we've seen before, and even we've seen since,
Mhm.
but we had a connection to that one as Americans, and myself as Israeli and Jewish. I don't know how non-Jews might see it differently. I certainly imagine there's some variety there, but where it's like, this shit's real, like the human capacity for violence and to inspire violence in others, to your point, is
Mhm.
very real and must be taken very
Right.
seriously.
Well, it's the inspiring violence in others, because like, that's where I saw the connection with Manson. I'm not sure he actually murdered anybody.
He
I think
didn't.
he made others murder.
Made is a strong word, but yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the claim for
Yeah.
sure. That's why
Yeah.
he gets the epithet mindfucker. Yeah.
There's something I wanted to go back to, if you're up for it. You mentioned black magic, and I think you said enchantment, rhetoric as enchantment is getting into the realm of black magic, and I find it hard to draw the line,
Mhm. Mhm.
where bad behavior ends and black magic begins, or something like that. And I wondered if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think it has to do maybe with the application of the will, and the basic phenomenal mystery here is this connection between mind and the things of mind, the realm of mind, and matter, and the realm of matter. That's the mystery of an artist. They take an image from mind and then they manifest the thing, right? Whether it's a building or a piece of jewelry or a song, there's that crossing the barrier, which I'm going to argue later on in a couple of weeks is synonymous with crossing the chasm. But
Well, and it's also like the transition from the probabilistic to the deterministic universe,
right, that happens only in the now.
right?
Yeah.
So, but someone mucking about, maybe not fully aligned with their will, but their will kind of scattergun impacting others. Is that fundamentally different from somebody who intentionally, actually, what just jumped to mind is January 6th? Because I could buy that Trump might not have known that, things might get a little out of hand, and I think it's likely that there were all kinds of complicating factors, like a lot of FBI agents in the crowd and stuff like that. It seems like
Yep.
that's
And a lot of
established at this
narrative
point.
control. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I think your argument, had Trump used oratory intentionally to incite people to storm the Capitol, cause mayhem, death, destruction, undermine democracy, etc., that might have gone into the realm of black magic. And I'm guessing that you think what he did, since the will might not have been totally clear, and like there's some messiness there, that maybe it didn't. So yeah, maybe.
Well, the traditional way that it's thought about, and I've heard versions of this in both the Eastern and the Western traditions, is that the average person is not really capable of great evil or great good because their capacities are undeveloped. And that you sort of go up a ladder in developing capacities. And that you hit a certain point where you either go left or you go right. If you go right, you become a sage or a saint. If you go left, you become, in the Chinese tradition, that's where they call mogwai, right? Which people from that movie might recognize, right?
Gremlins, yeah.
Gremlins, yeah. Which means a demon.
Yeah.
So, there might be people that haven't actually studied to climb that ladder, but they might have certain natural capacities through obsession or fixations or inheritance or I don't know all the
Well, and then there's
dimensions to
the
this.
rap about methamphetamines in particular destroying the soul and making you open to possession.
And remember, I didn't say enchantment of the soul. That was Plato. We're
Mhm.
talking 350 BC. So this is not a new thing. And, with this idea of enchantment and using song or chants to to engage people, to entrap people's soul, right? And I mean, when you have what's the way to put this? When a con man is working a mark, they know when they have rapport. They know when the person is what would the colloquialism be? Eating out of their hand,
Hooked.
right? Yeah. Like a salesman knows when they have an easy sale, right? It's the same sort of thing. And so yeah, I mean, there's a phenomenon there. This is, I think, related to Kant's deontology, where he says we can't use people as a means. Well, any of these things that have to do with manipulating people's consciousness in any other way than teaching, which is to say, with the strictest relationship with truth and justice, like Aristotle's definition of good rhetoric. Anything in that category, Plato considered some form of witchery, as in, words are powerful in ways that we don't recognize all the time. Now, if you have been along with us this whole ride, and you were back at episode 1 where we uncovered the idea of the semantic world and we sort of pointed at that, which itself is a sort of a phenomenological tool, right? It looks at our subjective experience, how we go about it. You'll realize that language is the currency of that world, language and image and human emotion, right? So if somebody can work that, then they can actually have effects over your semantic reality. And we see, like, they've done experiments, and that was one of my points, is that, with Helena Riefenstahl, one of the things, she was one of producing propaganda films for Hitler. She was also the voice piece for the "how could we have known" excuse argument. So anyway, I guess there's some sort of a relationship there.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about that's like kind of corollary to the claim um, is what about the crowd? And you said something earlier that I found really interesting that is along the lines of the responsibility on the individual for moral courage has never been greater than it is today. And I don't remember discussing that, you and I, and I'm not sure if I agree with it, but it makes sense because we're in this period of emergence and we have to figure out how individuals manifest in the context of the collective good, and that's a hard problem, and so it would make sense that the tension there might be greater than ever. I'm curious to hear more of why
Mhm.
you think it's greater than ever, but where I'm going is, well, what about the crowd? And we see a lot of examples today of people not not only failing to speak truth to their peer group, but even failing to recognize that that might even be to their moral benefit. And
Right.
and I think Douglas Murray titled one of his books "The Madness of Crowds," and
Mhm.
obviously we saw that during the Third Reich,
Right.
and we see it in ways today also.
Well, see, that was kind of my point earlier, was that in Hitler's day, they were just sort of like stumbling on this technology of how to really amp up the power of rhetoric. 'Cause now you can do movies, right? Well, every technological advance in communications has a corresponding advance in its rhetorical impact, which means its persuasive ability, which also means it's for good or ill, who knows? So I mean, that's why it's not like I wish that dialectic had made the advances that rhetoric has made.
Oh, that's interesting. What makes you think it hasn't? Because I would think that the same technological capabilities would fuel any like, we see debate out in the
Right,
world, like, there was just this Douglas Murray and David Smith debate on Rogan's
right.
podcast, that 20,000,000 or 40,000,000 or whatever
That's
saw it.
why. That's why I say that, because debate is not dialectic.
Okay.
Debate is interlinking rhetoric,
Right,
and
right, right.
it's competitive, and there's a winner and a loser purportedly.
But s
But
why
dialectic
isn't
is not.
dialectic benefited by technology also? So
Well,
that
I
was a
think
poor
because we're
example.
not in the habit of it, because we haven't taken our Platonic vitamins, because we haven't grown in moral capacity, and where that came, there's a lot of theories about that, whether it was the interaction of the church or whether God is dead or it's technology or it's but the reason that I say there's a story through history, it's kind of that Hegelian idea of the phenomenology of spirit, that something's been happening across history through time that started with the Greeks. Because there were a lot of people back in the ancient Greek times we're not talking about. We're talking about the Greeks because of this idea of democracy and a new role for the individual. And then we have the Reformation. Well, the Reformation doesn't just mean that the church is gone. The hinge pin of the Reformation is the doctrine of the universal priesthood. That means the priest is no longer an intercessory between you and deity. You, as an individual creature of God, have your own relationship with God. Well, that's power to the individual. You don't need to confess to the priest. You have your own relationship to the deity. Well, then we have the French Revolution, the American Revolution. We have egalite, for God's sakes, fraternité and liberté.
Liberté, yeah.
Like when has that been the case, right? It's always been kings, it's always been warlords, it's always been the people that game the system. And that's like gravity to this whole enterprise, right? Is that calling back to the lower emotions, to that will to receive, to that creatureness rather than creatorness. And so that ultimately pulls down all these efforts to fly, right? And so with the American Revolution, we see that same idea that now it's not just that the kings have granted me these rights are inalienable and they come from God, right? Which is a metaphysic, right? But uh, that idea is that now this metaphysic empowers the individual, the judgment of the individual, as well as the action of the individual. And that means that if we have that power, that political power, we have to have the moral responsibility that goes along with that political power. And before I can act on moral courage, which is an important part of this conversation that I'm not sure we gave a good treatment to, I have to have a certain degree of moral clarity because understanding must precede action. And that understanding is reason based, not emotion based. Because if it's emotion based, I might be the victim of rhetoric and not seeing the thing for
Or the
myself
perpetrator.
or the perpetrator, right? And a difficult but important point is that is the my personal rejection of this noble lie idea. And that is that if I were to use rhetoric to convince you of something, that even though you don't understand it yourself, I'm convincing you of the good thing or the right thing. That somehow, like I've manipulated you, but I've manipulated you for good. Like I lied to you to get you off the railroad tracks. I told you the house was on fire so that you would run out so that I could point to the stars. Some argument like that, right? And I don't know that that bears up under inspection. This is the first time it kind of bubbled up with a microscope on it, but there's some question there about that. And my instinct is to say, and maybe this is a Buddhistic impulse, that it's all about awareness, and that action that's doing the right thing for the wrong reason is as bad as doing the wrong thing for the right reason. We
I was
need the right
thinking of
thing for the right reason.
yeah, my reaction was I think if we were to throw the I Ching on that kind of question, we would likely get back something about that we have to let things play out. We have to give people the space to learn their own lessons. We have to know when to keep a distance and when to participate, like that kind of stuff. Not, oh yeah, yeah, you should go in and lie to save them, right?
Right,
Or
right.
burn the village to save it. I think is maybe the allegory that you land on when taken to an extreme.
Where you end up, yeah, yeah, the logical extreme,
Yeah,
yeah. And at least we saved the patient, kind of, but not really.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that that's the this is again, we come back up on that moral question. Does one have principles or does one try to do some impossible, invisible calculus, a consequentialist calculus to make excuses for one's best hopes?
And when you say moral clarity, I think you've defined that in the past as something like acting with a mindfulness about how our actions impact others.
Yeah, acting with wisdom, discerning and applying universal principles and values to foster personal growth, well being, and the greater good. I was reading that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And, or this idea of phronesis, that we can't formulate it as a set of rules. We just can't do that. That's part of what Heidegger and Being and Time is about. Is you're not give up the fantasy that you're going to figure this all out. You're not. You're going to have to learn to live with that somehow. You can see where he ended up with Sartre following in his steps, kind of the beginning of existentialism. But yeah, I mean, where do these transcendental values come from if not personal experience somehow? So that's why I like the idea of, for me, again, it comes down to hermeneutics. How do we not misunderstand? How do we not misinterpret? If we can really know that we're not misinterpreting, then we'll do the right thing. And that means that we need to have the best balanced, the best picture of the coast of Norway, that in our semantic world, so that our semantic world gives us the greatest base with which to harmonize what the individual piece under observation to resonate it clearly. And that's what was inherent in the genius of the Indian tribes' way of going about their businesses. I was on a jury with a couple guys from the Navajo tribe, and it was a 6-week trial. So we spent a lot of time together, a lot of time just hanging out because we couldn't talk about the case. So we just, literally just hanging out. And so I said to him, what would you do in the traditional way to solve a problem like this, to make a decision, a community decision? And he said, well, we'd all get around to the chapter house and then everybody get a chance to talk. And then the old people would tell us what the deal was, right? It's like we all bring our pieces, and then the old people, which hold the collective hermeneutic pot of the whole, like they're the holders of the cultural whole or coherence. And from the wisdom of that collectively held coherence, they tell us how this piece fits into that picture. And then that's what we do. Now, he didn't say it that way.
there's
He
a
just
scene
said,
at
"The
the
old people tell us what to do."
yeah. There's a scene in Dances with Wolves where the what I don't remember which Native American tribe that is that Costner is hanging out with, but
The Lakota, I think.
yeah, um, they're sitting in a circle figuring out what to do, and each person says their piece, young, old, doesn't matter. And that clip was used in my first exposure to dialogue because it sort of represents, in order for us to have shared understanding, we have to get everybody's perspective in the middle of the room so we can all get a look at it. Everybody's holding a piece of the potential shared understanding. And they actually have to be integrated for shared understanding to take place. So,
Right?
yeah.
And see, one of the dangers of that is misunderstanding that to be the relativistic universe where all truths are equal and there's no right point of view. That's exactly wrong. In fact, the right point of view is like that mystical one and hole in one golf shot. And we're trying to accumulate better and better and better and better. And we need it all. We don't need it all to lose the idea of better. We need it all to distill better out of it. And that's why the elders represent a different resource than the new people, the young people, because they've got all of this experience to resonate the new piece against, right? They've read so much of the book. They know how that next collective page goes. And if they're elders in a collective situation like a tribe, they they literally hold that hermeneutical base collectively, like they hold a cultural understanding together that exists separate from any one individual that makes it up. And that's really what a heritage is. It's not just oh, we have fun stories about this and that. No, we've got frameworks for thought, right? Which is a theme that I will be revisiting later in the month. Um, but these frameworks enable us to take the new and the unique that just got spit out by the possibilistic universe and to understand what are the potential results of our actions based on how we face it. And that's the key. What do we do? What do we do? Right? In that American pragmatic way. So yeah, there's a thing at work there. And so if we have this idea of a cultural understanding and we've got all this stuff and we're trying to build it because now we're much bigger than an Indian tribe and we've got a much more complicated collective semantic world that's now got mechanized narratives dumped into it in industrial levels, hyper novelistically imprinted, right? And the human system collectively is going like, whoa, right? We got like an information shotgun here. And you can feel a lot of the race going, you know, just from that shot. And but that's why I think it's a critical time to make that distinction internally, phenomenologically. What is our subjective experience of how things pull us to action, and from what center those things pull us? Are we pulled by self-interest? Are we pulled by our love of truth? Are we pulled by our duty? Are we pulled by our fear? Are we, all those things? Who and what do I let take the wheel and steer? Today's rock and roll reference. I think is it Incubus Drive? Is that the,
I don't know.
okay. I'll dig it out. Yeah. Sometimes I let the fear take the wheel and steer. But then I realize I should be the one behind the wheel. Good job, folks. Good job. That's the story. And what's the other one? That this other way of making decisions seems to have a vaguely haunting appeal, or something. There's a line like that in it that's great. A haunting mass appeal seems to have a haunting mass appeal. Yeah, well, that's that mechanism that we're talking about, and again, if we're dependent on in history with civil rights and the vote and all of these different things to have the power to exert moral force, then we have to have that responsibility to maintain a desire for moral clarity and to be willing to pay a certain price for it and to be willing to kind of understand what is the complications there. What are the things I put on the altar? That's the courage part of moral courage, right? Is that yeah, I'm just got to do what you got to do what's right because what was that quote? To know what's right and to not do it is the lowest act of cowardice. Slap. You know? It's like a that's like one of the chaklas with across the the flip-flops, the abuela's, favorite weapon of choice.
Huaraches, yeah,
Huaraches could be, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, made out of car tire rubber, right?
That'd be the Central American version, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, so I'm wondering if there is a circling back to the phenomenology of Hitler that kind of puts a bow on the topic, at least for today.
Uh-huh.
So I guess I'm like we talked about what Hitler represents and the relationship of that to how we how we go forward with this individual responsibility for moral clarity. Maybe that responsibility being greater than it ever has been before. And I can see for also for reasons of the stakes being higher in some ways, right?
The stakes being higher and the tools being used against it being more refined and
Yeah.
more developed, and, but also this is what immunizes you against Hitlers.
Mhm.
It isn't that you stop some outside Hitler from springing up. This is, like the science fiction
You
stories
gotta
of get
stop
him.
your inner Hitler.
You have to stop your inner Hitler. Like Wilhelm Reich wrote a book called The Murder of Christ. And his point, what he was writing about, is that how in each human being, Christ is remurdered.
Yeah.
We murder Christ within ourselves. And so the lesson of the resurrection, that's where the resurrection needs to happen. And how does that happen? Well, we walk back into righteousness. We get right with God. We become what it is by in divine intent to be. All that stuff, all that spitting up the apple that was the fall from grace. And so, but I mean, and now it is more pragmatic, and now it does come from more directions, and the stakes are higher than ever. There's more human life out there. There's more suffering to be had than ever before. There's uh,
Are there people out there that you think kind of emulates the wrong word that
uh,
epitomize this dealing with their inner Hitler?
well, I mean, I think that is what the spiritual path really is about. That's what the
I'm wondering in the public sphere if you see that at all.
oh Oh, there's another rock and roll reference there from Jack Johnson. Where have all the good people gone? You know that song?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't see him on the TV shows.
Hmm.
Well, that's why we need this new medium thing, and why we need modeling these new behaviors. And it might just take a new set of fools to do that. Um, but I think it is something that wants to happen, and maybe that's what like we talked about the eyeballs that show back up on the fruit flies. Because something about the plan says eyeballs are going to be part of this, and by whatever mechanism that those eyeballs got back in there, right? And it could well be that the same is the case. I mean, I trust that it is the case with the fulfillment of human potential and the human incarnation, because it has to do with, this is an interesting thing coming out of Heidegger, and that is that it's something about the nature of being as it manifests in human makes us question what is being as it manifests in humans, which is this consciousness conscious of consciousness, which is a very special state, which the argument is something's trying to happen. And that we can, yeah, here's a good quote from Terence McKenna. He said, that it does seem like nature is moving in this direction, which was, for him, was the eschaton. And he says it's not something that you're going to be able to screw up with your Volvos and your Cuisinarts. That was just a particular, when he spoke in Santa Fe years ago. And and what is he saying there? He's saying that you have your lower emotions and your higher emotions. You have your impulse to and push stuff, everything into your mouth. And you also have your understandings of truth and justice and beauty, and your actions. Every day, your decisions dangle between those two sets of impulses. So every day you have the choice. And you might look at, okay, well, I want to try to make the choice, the right choice, because that's still a very externally oriented understanding of it. You don't do right in the world just because the world needs right to be done in it. You do right in the world because it's an expression of your realization having manifested to another higher degree. You've become more chunsu, and so that is just what you do when that's who you are. And that's why I think ethics is very tangled up with identity, and what this relationship between mind and matter. What do we, as responsible bridges between those two, what do we pull through? That's what we make us, right? That's how we persist through time.
First, we
So
make it us, and then we make it manifest in the world. We're like a portal for the transmutation of mind into matter.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And for the imbuement of matter with meaning, right? Which is like adding n dimensions to it, right? When something becomes meaningful, it's far more than what it is in a natural science sense, right? You got your grandfather's pocket watch. This is more than just a bunch of brass, right? And why? Well, there's nothing a machine is going to tell you why, because your grandfather carried it through the hardest times of his life, but he never pawned it. Or because, it had the engraving from your grandmother in it and he carried it in the trenches in World War II or something, like the human experience through time is one of the things that generates meaning. And it's, so this is part of our unique nature. This, again, this Aristotelian idea that we want to be what it is to be a human that is uniquely human, which is to really absorb and to live out of meaning. And that is your anti-Hitler pill. You're not going to invent a machine and you stick all the babies and you see whether the Hitler light lights up or not. You're not going to be able to do scientific brain scans, right? You have to understand the mechanism hermeneutically. You have to understand the whole, how this part is playing its role within the whole. And you got to use your whole brain to do that, which is that whole other fun topic.
Well, maybe that's a place to pause.
I think so. And yeah, I don't have anything else other than to tell people that we have some cool stuff coming up.
Stay tuned.
So tell all your friends, your acquaintances, that guy on the street who keeps following you around. All
Any
that.
old fool. Yeah.
Any old fool. Cool. Great.
Thank you, Brian.
We'll see everybody later. Bye bye.